a horrific tragedy on the Danube, another stabbing in Israel, and what the heck is going on in Honduras? We'll break it all down on today's Hot Zone.
Engaging with the news in a whole new way, international war correspondent Chuck Holton brings insight into areas of crisis and lets you help those affected.
Howdy, folks. Chuck Holton here, back from vacation with another great episode of the Hot Zone for your entertainment and edification. The podcast is growing by leaps and bounds, and that's a good thing. So thanks for your support and feedback. I want the Hot Zone to get better and better as we keep giving you the news and commentary about things that really matter, rather than just obsess for days and days about celebrity breakups or inside the Beltway shenanigans. I want to talk about the places where people really need help, because there are millions of real people out there around the world right now who could care less about Kanye or Pelosi because their lives are being turned upside down as we speak. And I don't just want to bring you their stories. I want to give you a way to reach into their lives and help them directly. It's a new kind of news gathering that really hasn't been tried before, and you get to be part of it. So just go to patreon.com/hotzone to subscribe for $3 a month. And soon, as in within a couple of days, I'll be off to another big trip to Afghanistan. It's my first trip there in 5 years. And I'll bring you not only the ground truth about what's going on there, but I'm going to bring you bring some cheer to the U.S. troops that are stationed there and let you come along with me when I do it. All right, let's get to the news. Protesters in Honduras set fire to the front gate of the U.S. Embassy in Tegucigalpa over the weekend. The weird thing is nobody's exactly sure why. They were protesting rumors that the Honduran government was about to privatize their healthcare system, and they didn't like that. And the government denies the whole thing, but that has literally nothing to do with the United States. It also came out over the weekend that the president of Honduras, Juan Orlando Hernandez, is, or at least was, being investigated by the DEA for being involved in a massive drug and money laundering scheme. But I can't figure out how that would cause Hondurans to be angry at us, especially since most of the country pretty much seems to hate their president. They call him by his initials JOH for getting himself reelected back in 2017. Now, see, the Honduran Constitution stipulates that the president can only serve one term, but somehow Joe got that changed so he could run for reelection. The country's basically been on fire since then, though many of the protests, they say, are being instigated by undercover Venezuelan provocateurs. But whatever the reason, all the protesting has at least 40% of the country, like 4 million people, planning to head north to the United States as soon as possible. And we're seeing lots and lots of unrest across Latin America. And most of it indeed has to do with Venezuela, because they're subsidizing countries across the region with cheap oil and have been for many years. But that golden goose has run out of eggs. And now countries like Haiti and Nicaragua are all up in arms as they're seeing huge price increases as the cost of fuel is no longer at artificially low prices. But there's a deeper issue at play in Latin America, and it strikes at the heart of the same kinds of worldview divisions that we see across in the United States right now. Many in Central America and South America adhere to what's called the Chavista worldview, which is named after Hugo Chavez. Essentially, it's socialist leanings. And for many years, politicians in places like Bolivia, Nicaragua, and elsewhere have been pitting the poor against the rich by spouting the same tired tripe we're starting to hear out of the United States from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others. Power to the people. Yeah, right. What they mean is making the people as dependent as possible on a government that takes all you have to ostensibly provide everything you need, which never works, but definitely gets out the vote. So far, at least 25 people have been injured in the protests in Honduras. Unfortunately, none of those were Americans at the embassy, which basically told its people to stay home that day and keep a low profile. But it does kind of make you scratch your head and wonder how, if so many of these Hondurans want to go to the United States, then why are they attacking our embassy? It just seems counterproductive. Anyway, let's move on. Last Wednesday night at about 9 p.m. in the Hungarian capital of Budapest, a sightseeing barge with 33 South Koreans and 2 local crew members on board collided with a much larger Viking Line's cruise ship near one of the famous bridges that spans the Danube between Buda and Pest. Now, Hungarian police say the smaller boat flipped over and sank in about 7 seconds. Now, 7 tourists are confirmed dead already, but another 19 Koreans and the 2 crewmen are still missing, presumed trapped and dead in the wreckage, or maybe swept away by the river, which has really been swollen by the heavy rain that's been severely hampering the emergency rescue operation. Only 7 South Koreans are known to have survived the disaster. Now, I was on the Danube River on a cruise like that back in 2016 on a ship that was almost identical to the one which caused the sightseeing barge to capsize. The river this time of year is really crowded with ships, and the currents are fast, especially this year since the water level's so high. But you can see by the video that I shot why it's such a popular place. Budapest is truly one of the most beautiful places in the world. But, you know, tragedy can strike anywhere, and this is a very unfortunate series of events, to be sure. The captain of the Viking cruise ship has already been arrested and will likely be charged with manslaughter for hitting the smaller boat, although to me it looks like by the video that the smaller boat sort of cut in front of the bigger ship. So I'm not sure why they think it's his fault. Now, the reason I was there back in 2016 was to join a cruise with some important American politicians and make a news feature about the migrant crisis in Europe. On that trip, I had a chance to talk to Newt Gingrich, former Speaker of the House, about the crisis. And what he said, I think, is applicable to our own migrant crisis we're seeing on the U.S. southern border. So take a listen.
When you start seeing hundreds of thousands of young males on the move, that is not a refugee crisis. A refugee crisis is women and young children. What you are seeing is the largest mass migration in modern times, and you're seeing it from 2 very different directions. You have a largely Syrian migration coming out of the Middle East. You have an enormous migration coming north out of Africa. If you're in Italy, the vector is Libya. If you're in Greece, the vector is Turkey and Syria. But what's happening to Europe is huge numbers of people are showing up who have no interest in being assimilated. I mean, you can have a successful immigration policy if you're bringing in people who are willing to become French or British or American or whatever. But if you start importing people who explicitly reject your culture, reject your values, reject your religion, and who want to have enclaves of their own, you're really buying long-term problems on an enormous scale.
This is Vienna, Austria, capital of a nation with a well-earned reputation as one of the friendliest, most welcoming and charitable people on earth. It's also important to note that here in Europe, there's no country with a constitution or a Bill of Rights protecting the right of an individual to keep and bear arms. But here in Austria, there's a new reality. As millions of asylum seekers flood into Europe from the Middle East, Southwest Asia, and Africa, there's been a corresponding spike in violent crime, robberies, assaults, rapes, and murders, and high-profile radical Islamist terror attacks like those in Paris and Brussels. And now, tens of thousands of Austrians are applying for permits to purchase firearms for self-protection.
The reason why Austrians nowadays think about home defense is actually of this immigrant crisis in Europe. Yeah. Since the attacks, customers, they are asking for pepper sprays, for combat training, or even hand-to-hand combat, and small concealed carry weapons like Kubotans. Women are, if they are outside in the evening, you have some big crowds, most of the time immigrants, of course, and that's a big issue. That's a big issue because our security level nowadays is not really on the top level anymore. I live in a very urban area, and nearby I have a subway station, and you see the crowds. You see the crowds. They're shouting, they're drinking, and so security feeling is not really present anymore.
Now, the migrant crisis in Europe is still happening, although the press has sort of got tired of reporting on it. Over the weekend, a migrant center in Bosnia caught fire, and more than 20 people got injured in that fire. Those people are frustrated, just like the migrants coming into the United States. Here's one of those migrants describing the scene.
Last night and last morning, today morning, when we wake up, we saw a lot of fire in the camp, and there are a lot of people injured. But there is no anywhere for running for all immigrants. So in this way, we jump some people jump from second floor, and some people jump from third floor. So they break their legs and the bones, and so many injured. They transfer.
So the effect of all this migration is that Europe is shifting politically much further to the right. And people are starting to realize that when you institute massive socialized programs to care for your people, but then fail to control your borders, you'll very likely see millions of people from outside your country who have never contributed to your system showing up with their hands out, looking to cash in on your generosity. And that's when your system starts to break down. All right, let's go on to talk about Israel. There were 2 more stabbing incidents in Jerusalem last week, both carried out by Palestinians. One attack occurred early in the morning, about 6:20 a.m. Israeli police say officers at the scene in Jerusalem shot and killed one suspect, a Palestinian guy from the West Bank who has been allowed into Israel for the last Friday of Ramadan, according to police, to worship. Now, the first stabbing occurred near the Damascus Gate. The victim was evacuated to the hospital where he remains in critical condition. The 50-year-old Jewish man was on his way to pray at the wall when he was stabbed in the neck and head. The other victim was a 26-year-old man.
What we know is one terrorist carried out a stabbing attack at the Damascus Gate. As a result, one Israeli was injured seriously at the scene. Immediately after that, police units searched in and around the area of the Old City, where the terrorist was found inside the Jewish quarter area. What we know is that one other Israeli was stabbed during the attack itself. Heightened security is continuing in and around the area of the Old City in order to prevent any further terrorist attacks. The terrorist himself was shot at the scene by police units that responded. And security measures will continue throughout the day, the last Friday of Ramadan, and units are mobilized in and around the area of the Old City, including the Muslim quarter, the Jewish quarter, the Christian quarter, and the Armenian quarter.
There have been at least 9 terror attacks in Israel this year by Palestinians that have resulted in Jews being killed or wounded. Stabbings are one of the more common ways Palestinians like to try to kill Jews. About 40% of all terror attacks against Jews in Israel last year were carried out that way. But Palestinians are sort of equal opportunity murderers when it comes to that. They'll just as happily use guns, rockets, or ram their car into a crowded bus station. It should be noted that these attacks would be much, much more deadly if Israel wasn't such a heavily armed society. And because of their universal military service requirement, among other things, the good guys who are carrying weapons tend to be pretty well trained in their use. And that's a real good thing that we could take note of. Now, somebody take a guess about how many terror attacks have been perpetrated by Jews in the past 10 years. Right. Not very many. Not 0, but probably less than a dozen, mostly aimed at Palestinians whose elected government openly calls for the murder of all Jews and the destruction of the Jewish state. So there's that. All right, well, that's all I've got for today, folks. Thanks for watching. Remember, I'm headed to Afghanistan later on this week, and I'm looking forward to bringing you some really great content from the war zone over there as I embed with U.S. troops, my own son included. Prayers appreciated as always, and thanks again for being a part of the Hot Zone.